Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Unplugged by Shape America. I'm your host, Stephanie Morris, and today my special guest is Kennedra Tucker, who works for the Department of Defense Education Activity. She serves as the Health and Physical Education Instructional Systems Specialist, and she's located in Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome, Kennedra, and thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invite.
So Kennedra, first and foremost, there's so much that has happened in our country and the world over the last 2 weeks. It's overwhelming, it's painful, it's exhausting in many ways. So I just need to ask, how are you right now? How are you doing?
So a couple of things. One, I want to say that you did allude to my position and what I do, and I just want to expound on that. So I am the Health and PE ISS is what we call ourselves for short, Instructional Systems Specialist. And I work for the school system that serves 70,000 military connected students all across the world. So we have schools in the Americas, and we have schools in Europe, and we have schools in the Pacific. So we really do have a global perspective in terms of the students that we serve. I also have to mention that, and in my official capacity, I am not here for that. I am here personally for my own personal beliefs. So anything that I say is in no way representative of DODEA or my position as the Health and PE Specialist. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there. So now we have the housekeeping business out of the way. In terms of how I'm doing, I'm feeling much better this week. And I'm usually very honest. And I want to say that we were scheduled to do this interview about a week and a half ago. And I reached out to you and I said, I would rather hold off and reschedule it because I wasn't in the mental space to do it after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. That's a lot going on at one time. And I was feeling stressed. I was feeling overwhelmed. I was feeling angry, upset. I was hurt. And so I didn't want to speak on the topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion, knowing that that was the mental space that I was in. So I took time for myself to reflect, and I appreciate us rescheduling this so that I could speak openly and clearly about these topics. So now I feel a bit re-energized. I'm feeling hopeful. One, I have a self-care routine. So I work out an hour every day, and that helps me. It helps me clear my mental space. It helps me to stay physically ready. It helps me to do what I'm supposed to do mentally, and it helps me to show up with my whole self. I also make it a point to eat healthy as much as possible. So I try to I've been making all my meals for the past 2.5 months because I'm paranoid about, people being sick and fixing food and all that. So I've been really eating fruits and vegetables every day. And I've been drinking like a half a gallon of water every day. So I feel so much better, but that's me. For me to really get back to 100%, I have to maintain a routine. And I have to do one that includes exercise, eating right, and yoga for mindfulness and meditation. So that's what I've been doing. The other thing I've been doing is when I have to cut social media off, I just don't log in. So I give myself a mental break. And also, when I have been logging in, I've been very hopeful to see that there have been mass protests about Black lives and racism all across the world. I mean, New Zealand, Denmark, England, Brazil. There's so many different people who are saying enough is enough. And that has really refueled me to do this work. And it's given me hope and it's re-energized me for the work that we do. So I'm in a better place than I was. I'm still fighting, I'm still pushing, but this is the first time I've seen this many protests. Well, really, this is the first time I've ever seen protests all across the world in regards to Black lives specifically. And so that makes me feel like this is a united effort.
Thank you for sharing all of that with us. Your honesty, your candid approach, it's so deeply valued and we really appreciate it. You have been a member of Shape America's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force, which kicked off last fall. So this is clearly something that you've really been thinking about, especially as it relates to our organization and our health and physical education community. Can you share with us a little bit about where you see our biggest challenges in trying to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion?
That's a good question. One of the challenges I see within any group of people is analysis paralysis. So this idea that you're overthinking and overanalyzing what you should do, that you don't move the needle forward enough. So I think that sometimes we want to take on a lot of different parts of a project or a lot of different parts of a task force, a lot of different parts of a movement, and it can get lost because we're trying to tackle too many things. So I think one of the challenges is identifying what our strategic goals are and all the key players who can help us move that goal forward. I think that's first and foremost. What is it we want to do? What can we do immediately? What can we do in the short term? What can we do in the mid-range goals? And what can we do in the long term? And I think that's very important because you don't want the work to get lost because there's so much work to be done. So I think that's a challenge. I also think the accountability piece is a challenge. A lot of times when I'm thinking about, and I'm talking to my colleagues about educators, for example, who've been teaching for 40 years, who don't have to teach anti-racist instruction, who don't have to show up in the way that we're showing up for our students and saying, hey, this is wrong, and let me talk to my students about it. Who holds them accountable? So I think one of the challenges for us is who's going to hold Shape America, who's going to hold us as an EDI task force accountable that the work actually gets done. We are all volunteers on our end of the task force. So I'm a volunteer and everybody else in the task force is a volunteer. And we are passionate about this work, but we're doing this work in addition to our full-time jobs, in addition to any other responsibilities that we have outside of SHAPE. So we have to be very intentional about holding ourselves accountable to the goals being achieved and the work getting done. So I think that's something else to think about. I think the other part is being uncomfortable and being willing to be uncomfortable and being willing to be called out. And I think sometimes when somebody says, like in Dr. Tara Blackshear's article, Shape So White, the first thing people want to do is put a defense up. But in order to move the conversation forward and move the goals forward, you have to be willing to accept when you're not doing something right and what needs to be implemented for change. So I think the other piece of that is, as a task force, holding ourselves accountable, not being defensive when other people hold us accountable, and then going to our membership and saying, okay, once we provide the resources, which we need to provide, what are you going to do with it? And how do we hold you accountable as educators in implementing these resources? So accountability, I would say analysis paralysis, like don't overthink it, get it done. Let's put the action steps in place and willing to be uncomfortable in these moments when we're being called out.
So well said, Kennedra. I agree with every single point you made, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in your response. What are your hopes to pivot to some positive thinking if we make progress, which we absolutely need to do in this area in the year ahead, in the next several years ahead? What does that look like for you? Can you just give us some thoughts on that vision that we're trying to work towards?
So I hope from a Shape America standpoint, and we've had this conversation, we've been having this conversation, I want to say for the past year and a half. I hope that everything that we do is in the lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion, from policies to resources that are put out, to lesson plans that we may share on our site, to encouraging more educators, Black educators specifically, to be a part of our organization, to be leaders in our organization. I hope in the long term and in the short term, these are things that happen. I also hope that we challenge people on what they can do individually to support this work. So right now, a lot of the conversation that I'm hearing is, oh, so what can I do? What can I read? What can I study? Because I feel like I'm behind in my knowledge of this topic. And this is, when we're talking about racism, we're talking about a centuries old system. So it's not going to be dismantled overnight. And so people are asking, so I feel like I need to catch up. Like, what am I missing? What do I need to do? Because when you see something happen like George Floyd, which was completely wrong, and we know that, one, you're in shock. You can't believe that's happening. And two, you don't know what to do right away to address that. So I think what we can do is give people concrete ideas for what they can do themselves to address these kind of issues. And the first thing I think we can tell people is own what you can own. So I am an educator. I work in a public system. But one of the things that we've been having this past week is conversations about this issue and how to get information to our teachers and to our students to address these kind of topics. So if you're an educator in a system, what can you own specifically? Are you questioning the curriculum that's being taught? Are you part of the team that's evaluating the curriculum and deciding, hey, you know, we need to have more anti-racist resources in our curriculum? If you're not a part of that team and you can't be, what kind of lessons are you designing that includes inclusiveness, that validates students who are of color, students who are Black, and says, you are an important part of this classroom, what you bring matters, and I'm going to make that as natural as using equipment in a classroom. So what are we doing intentionally to own the pieces that we can to support this kind of work? The other thing I think is what I would like to see, or I'm hopeful to see, is that we strategically tackle each part of the work. So you've got higher ed people in Shape America. We have teachers, K through 12 teachers in Shape America. We have scholars, professors, all these different people, and all of you own a piece of whatever you do. So in higher education, how are we preparing our teachers who are going to go into schools to be ready to have conversations and to create lessons around these topics? That's one part of it. How are we talking to our K through 12 educators? Are we having webinars? Are we having a series of conversations? I want to see content that is continuous, that is relevant, and that really gets to the heart of what people need. People need to know how to have conversations. People need to know where to find resources, and people need to know how to apply it in a meaningful way to do the work that they do every day. So every day, I'm a former elementary PE teacher in Maryland. And I love Maryland because we're always on point. Like, we're always ahead of the curve. That's just me being biased. I love Maryland. Anytime I need something, Maryland has already had it somewhere. Somebody has it as their resource in their back pocket. So Maryland is usually, in my opinion, ahead of the curve when it comes to certain things. And so what we have to think about is, what are we doing intentionally to push this work forward? And what resources are we providing to our teachers that, and this is how I think, if I'm sitting down as an elementary teacher and I have a 30-minute planning period, I can click something, I can pull up a resource, I can understand it within that however many minutes, 30 minutes, and then I can reflect on how I can use that resource the next day. I personally like resources that I can get something out of and apply. I'm not going to necessarily, if I'm not teaching anymore, but if I have a 30-minute planning period, I might not read an article that's 30 or 40 pages, but I might click on a 5-minute video clip and go, oh, that's a great idea. I can include that in my warm-up tomorrow and affirm my students. So I think we have to be very intentional, and that's what I would like to see in terms of the resources that we offer. I definitely want to see an EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion conference. And I know we had one scheduled for August. I'd like to see that go on. And I'd like to see in the larger Shape America conference, I'd like to see this theme running throughout our sessions. And I want to see it every single year. It's not a check the box, oh, you know, we did EDI last year, now we're going to do something different this year. No, it should be a part of the fabric and of the framework of who we do. I'm not Black one day and not the next day. So it's the same thing. It should be not an off and on switch. It should be something that's embedded in every single thing that we do.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I am really excited to hear you say all of that, because yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all of those really thoughtful reflections about where we're going and what this needs to look like. Yes, I absolutely am 100% with you on all of it. So thank you so much again for spending some time with us today, Kennedra. I think there's so much for all of us as a community to really absorb and reflect on what you've offered today. And I know that we will all do that and continue doing this incredibly important work, which is, as you said exactly, is not a check the box PR kind of effort. It never will be. And that means it's frustrating at times because it feels slow, too slow, and it has been too slow. And I fully own that and I'm accountable for that. But it has to be intentional, thoughtful, and really grounded in a diverse array of perspectives, informing us and pushing us in the right direction. So with that, thank you again. Do you have any closing words for our audience today?
Sure. One of the things I want to share too is that when we think about resources to provide, we always think about educators, but I also wanted to challenge us to think about our parents and our community. And so I'm just going to share some personal experiences that I've had. So growing up, I went to a Catholic school from K through 12. I went to two different schools. I went to one school from K through 8, and I went to another school from 9 through 12. And it was in third grade that I learned about protests. I was 8. And the school I went to, the Catholic school I went to, and it's amazing to think about this now, because when I think about public education, I've only taught in public schools, but I went to Catholic schools. And I think about how progressive we were at that time in the 80s. We marched to Washington. We were already in Washington, D.C. We marched downtown as 8-year-olds with our teachers, and we protested the Rodney King verdict. We protested this. I remember making signs. I remember us leaving the class. I remember all of this. And I'm thinking now, like, wow, we did this, and this was a school effort. So at the age of 8, I learned the importance of standing up for injustice. So I want to challenge us to think about how, and I'm not a parent, so I never claim to know how to parent or to step into a parent's shoes. But I also want us to think about the resources we give to our parents. What can we ask them to ask their school for? So in my case, we were learning about social justice in school. So when we think about math and science and social studies and all of these core subjects, what kind of social justice, anti-racist lens do they have? And asking parents to ask the critical questions about, how is this showing up in the curriculum that your child is learning? What kind of activities are your kids doing around these topics? The other thing is, in 6th grade, same Catholic school, we read the book To Be a Slave by Julius Lester. Again, they're teaching us our history from the standpoint of what really went on. They weren't sugarcoating anything. And so again, I think we also have to be intentional about what we ask our parents. We're always asking people to advocate for health and physical education, advocate for funding, make sure we get this. Let's now start asking parents to advocate for anti-racist resources and social justice resources in school. Let's be just as intentional about the funding as we are about the resources and the kind of education our kids get. So I think we focus a lot on educator resources, but I also think that we may need to start pushing out parental resources and community resources. Here's where you can go, even if it's a resource on a website, here's where you can go if you want to be a part of this social action. So I think that's important as well. I mean, I'm all for education, but education comes in different forms, and it's not just the physical and the health piece. It's the social piece, which impacts the health piece. It impacts the mental piece. So it's all related, if that makes sense.
It does. And again, I could not agree more. So thank you so much for all of this. I just really appreciate your time and your thoughtful contributions, because there's so much important thinking here. And again, just things we really need to reflect on and do deeper dives with, and consider how it impacts our work at Shape America in terms of the resources and professional development we put out, and everything that we do, really. Everything that impacts our leadership pipelines, our awards programs, all of that. There's so much work to do, and this is really good. This is a really good way to frame it up in many ways and consider it.
Awesome, thank you. I was reading Dr. Blackshear's, and we talked about this. I read her article, and I really appreciate how she said, we have to look at our practices. And she said this when we met with her, and we have to look at bringing Black educators in to talk about the standards and the curriculum, and making sure that their impact is a part of all of that. Mm-hmm. So not working in these silos, but bringing in Black educators to help create these pieces, looking at the standards and instructional materials. And I think we have to be intentional about that as well.
Absolutely. I love everything that you just said. And yes, we will make that happen.
Awesome.
So thank you. Yes. Thank you again, Kennedra, for being our guest today. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode of Unplugged as much as I did. There's so much meaningful conversation happening here, and we will continue it. And we hope to hear from you about how you feel about it as well. So thank you again, Kennedra, for joining me. Thank you to all who listened today, and I hope you'll join us for our next episode of Unplugged as well.